Hello, this is Dr. James Strickler, and this is Chapter 10, Religion and Reform, in the United States History Textbook, American Yawp. The first issue to cover in this chapter is religious reform. The United States during the antebellum period, between the end of the American Revolution and the onset of the American Civil War, experienced a great many changes. Some of these changes were the political transformation of the country, from the Federalist Party, who had led us through the American Revolution, to the dominance of the Republican Party, beginning with Thomas Jefferson's victory in the election of 1800. Another major source of change in the United States during this time period was the coming of the Industrial Revolution, which altered the way goods were produced in the United States, setting the stage for the United States to become a major economic player in the world and transforming the lives of people who began to move from the countryside to the cities to work in factories. This then led to another important change, that of free labor. Prior to this, people had been trained in occupations through the apprentice system, which would oftentimes lock them into close relationships between master and apprentice that would go on for generations with people stuck in the same professions as their parents before them. With the factory system coming into place because of the Industrial Revolution and the labor in the factory being less skilled, people could move from job to job, from place to place more easily. With that freedom, though, came the problem of wages being driven down for them, which might necessitate multiple family members going to work at the same time, such as women and children. This is a big change in many ways from the agrarian society that had existed before of people laboring on farms. Another big change was immigration. While the United States of America was primarily founded by immigrants who had come from England, in the years that followed, immigrants came from other countries, particularly dislocated people from Ireland and Germany came to the United States looking for a better life. They then settled in different areas, the Germans in the countryside to become farmers, the Irish in cities to become industrial workers. And this wave of immigration caused those who thought of themselves now as Native Americans to experience great dislocation in their lives as they suddenly had to deal with foreigners. At the same time, the country was growing dramatically, more than doubling in its size during this time period. New states were added one after another, and vast territories were settled. All these dramatic changes left people feeling disconnected from their communities. They wanted some sense of belonging, and they needed to find some new way to feel centered in their lives, and they found this in religion. This then led to the Second Great Awakening. We had talked about the First Great Awakening previously in this course. That was a time period in American history where the colonists had come to believe that their children had gotten too comfortable in life. The hard life of initially settling on this continent had already passed, and their children were growing up in relative luxury, losing the contact with the values of hard labor and things like that. They wanted to reinstill values in their children, and they turned to religion. Well, something similar happened a few decades later with the Second Great Awakening. Now all society, not just parents looking at their children, but all society is feeling off kilter, like they've been thrown into some world that they don't understand anymore. They need something solid to hold onto, and they found this in a reinvigoration of their Christian faith. As it happened in the First Great Awakening, this was inspired by itinerant preachers moving from place to place, staging revivals to get people to come and join their faith. One of the first of these great revivals took place in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. It lasted for several days, and scores of preachers came to preach there. At its height, so many people were in attendance that estimates are that 1/10 of the population of Kentucky was there for this revival. This shows just how hungry people were for something to organize their lives around again after so many things had been thrown into chaos by the dramatic changes of the previous years. Well, this revival spirit spread across the country. Preachers would go out on circuits. In other words, they would go from place to place on a set schedule, preaching in one town, then another, and eventually working their way around again. They would come in and they would hold these big dramatic meetings where they were appealing more to people's emotions to become emotionally connected with God, to become emotionally connected with Christ, rather than worrying so much about orthodox teaching of doctrines found in the scriptures. This was a new way of looking at religion in this time, and it inspired people. One of these ministers that did this was Charles Gradson Finney, who was particularly well known as one of these itinerant ministers who inspired the people to re-embrace religion during the Second Great Awakening. An area that was particularly hit by this was the northern part of New York State. So many preachers came through here holding so many revivals that led so many people to join one church or another that it became known as the burned over district. This was an idea that there was no one there left to set a fire beneath because they had already all been consumed by the previous revivals that had come through. Well, this burned over district then gave birth to several new religious movements that sprung out of it. We'll talk about some of these more later. As a result of this religious revival during the Second Great Awakening, membership in various religious denominations greatly expanded during this time period. The Methodists particularly benefited from it, as did the Baptists, and they became two of the bigger denominations in the United States of America. This feeling of having been reinvigorated in religion then caused people to want to bring what they had found to others. This led to the creation of the American Bible Society in 1816, which used modern technology, the printing press, to create Bibles cheaply that then they could send off to distribute on the frontier. So people out settling in the territories who might not have ministers that could come and visit them could instead have a Bible with them to grow closer to God through. A few years later, the American Tract Society was created, which published vast numbers of little booklets focused on various religious issues. In some cases, they would have goals to get a tract to every single family within a city and would come close to doing so. Another thing that came out of this movement was missionary work. Various groups, sometimes working together, such as through the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, would organize mission trips to elsewhere in the world, say to the islands of the Pacific or to the subcontinent of India, to bring their Christian gospel to people throughout the world. This Second Great Awakening was an egalitarian movement. Now, what is meant by that was that it involved people of all classes, and this was a change from previous views of religion. Prior to things like the Second Great Awakening coming along, it was thought that to be a minister, you had to go to college and receive a degree in divinity, where you had been trained in the teachings of the religion, and then you could go preach them to others. During the Second Great Awakening, just normal people felt a call to preach. They felt inspired by the Holy Spirit and decided to go out and preach to other people, and in some cases became extremely successful doing it. Among the people inspired by the Second Great Awakening were individuals like Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone, who felt that not just individual people's faith needed to be re-inspired, but churches needed to be rebuilt. They felt that they had drifted away from the original New Testament church that had been founded by Jesus Christ. They wanted to restore the Christian church back to its original way of doing things. A particularly important person in these restorationist ideals was a man named Joseph Smith. In the year 1820, as a teenage boy, Joseph Smith claimed that he had a vision after praying which church he should join. And in that vision, God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to him and told him that he should join none of the churches, for they had all drifted away from the original gospel of Christ. Later, he was directed to a set of gold plates that had been buried in the ground, with the record of inhabitants of the American continent prior to the coming of the Europeans, who had also worshipped Jesus Christ. He was led to it, he claimed, by an angel named Moroni, and the record was called the Book of Mormon. He then translated it into English, and those who believed his stories and followed him, because the name of the book was the Book of Mormon, became known as Mormons. The Mormons experienced a great deal of persecution after he formed them together as a church. The reasons for that were that his preaching was extremely popular. The church grew quickly, but they also had different beliefs than other people. And so as a result, they had to continually move from one place to another to avoid the persecution. On the left, you can see a map of their migrations. Along the way, as they moved, they gathered additional members to their church. Eventually, they settled in a city that they built in Illinois called Nauvoo. It swelled for a time to become bigger than the city of Chicago. The official name of the Mormon Church is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, although most people don't call them by that name. Eventually, in 1844, the people in the area around Nauvoo had also grown distrustful of the Mormons, and Joseph Smith was arrested and eventually killed by a mob. But this was not the end of the Mormon religion, because one of his followers, a man named Brigham Young, ended up being a very competent leader himself, and he led the Mormons on a march across the Great Plains to eventually settle in the Salt Lake area of what would become Utah. While the Mormons may be the most prominent and long-lasting of the religious groups that were born out of this Second Great Awakening, others also had times of brief flourishing. An example of this were the Shakers. The Shakers we've mentioned previously. They were a sect that got this nickname because of their shaking that would come in their meetings when they felt overcome by the Holy Spirit. Now, they are particularly noteworthy because of their extreme views about human sexuality. The Shakers believed that when you were truly devoted to God, you'd be entirely celibate, not engage in sexual practices at all. On the other end of this extreme, showing the great experimentation that took place during this time period among religious groups, was the ONEIDA community, led by a man named John Humphrey Noyes. These people practiced what they called complex marriage, which meant that everybody in the community was married to everybody else. So men and women could pair up for sexual relations as they saw fit, resulting in children that might have any person as their mother or father in the community and were raised communally together. Not all experimentation and reform during this time period, though, was religious. A lot of it was social also, though the roots of that came from religious origins too. One of the religious groups to come out of the Second Great Awakening were the Unitarians. They were a group that rejected many Orthodox Christian notions. They believed, for example, that Jesus Christ was not divine, that there was just one Father in heaven. That's why they're called Unitarians, because they believe in just one God, rather than Trinitarians, believing in three, God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. They rejected other Orthodox beliefs of Christianity too. They found great successes in the divinity schools of certain universities, including Harvard University in Massachusetts. But what happened was there ended up being disagreement there among the Unitarian ministers and the things that were taught at Harvard. There was even disagreement within the Unitarian Church. This then led to some Unitarian ministers there in Boston, Massachusetts, to form the Transcendental Club, It was a place where they could get together and talk about their problems with their own church, the Unitarian Church, and with Harvard University. Well, this club expanded, and it ended up having many prominent members, including a poet and a Unitarian minister named Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was one of the founders of the club. Another member of the club was a man who would end up becoming a prominent philosopher and prominent writer, a man named Henry David Thoreau. He wrote a book about his escape to a place called Walden in Massachusetts, where he went, as he put it, to live life deliberately, and come one day when he died to not discover that he had not lived, but instead to live deeply and suck out all the marrow of life. This was the kind of view that you got from the Transcendentalists. They were rejecting a world that was becoming more regimented and scientific and trying to find a world where they could find more spiritual satisfaction in nature and things like that. But they were not the only ones that were exploring, trying to find their sort of own wonderful new way to live life here on Earth. Instead, there are others who tried to create what has become known as utopian communities, where they tried to get out of the world and create their own perfect little communities. One of these was a place called Brook Farm that was ran by a man named George Ripley. It only lasted for a short time, and the people that settled there practiced a branch of Christianity called Fourierism. It was anti-capitalist. They thought that the economy of the modern world was evil, and so they formed a communal environment where everybody owned everything together and tried to cooperate together to support each other. These sorts of experiments tend to not last very long, like the ONEIDA community that I mentioned before and Brook Farm that I'm mentioning now. They would get together with these sort of brave new ideas and try them for a time, but eventually they would fall apart. Now, these religious movements were faced with a problem, though. And the problem was that, as we have previously discussed, beginning with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in Virginia in 1785, we had gone through a process in the country of disestablishing the church. Now, what I mean by that was, prior to this time period, all the states had official churches, or at least official religions. They were all overtly Christian, written into their laws and their constitution. But over several decades, they all disestablished the church. They separated the church and the government from each other. Now, in some ways, this has been very good for America, particularly if you are a religious believer. Countries in Europe where the church and the government remain tied together, oftentimes this was to the detriment of the church and it would dwindle. Here in America, Christian religions thrived after being separated. But there's a problem that goes along with it. And that is, as the government tries to promote virtues in their community, tries to get people to be good citizens, they are essentially trying to teach morality. Now, normally this is something that's done by the churches, but when the government and the church are separate, they aren't necessarily agreeing on what the citizens should be raised to do, to believe in, to be good citizens. So with the government kind of out of the religion business, it fell to other groups to try to reach out and instill what they saw as proper values in society. These private groups that formed were called reform societies, and together they have been described as trying to create what they called the benevolent empire. They wanted an America where social values would be geared to right living, where they would collectively decide to drive evils out of society and help each other out. Oftentimes, these groups were primarily staffed by middle-class women. Now, there's a reason for this. By middle class, what we mean is that these were women that came from families that had sufficient economic means that they didn't have to necessarily be laboring in the factory all day just to make sure the family would have bread to eat. They had some spare time. And they would use that spare time to go about trying to make the world a better place. Now, they felt kind of compelled to do this because women were viewed as the mothers of society, the ones that instilled the basic values in their children. So it's not a great leap for them to see that they need to go instill those basic values in the society as a whole. Here we see women illustrated as breaking up barrels filled with alcohol and breaking bottles and pouring them out to shut down a saloon in their neighborhood because they didn't want men drinking alcohol. Well, these voluntary associations that were created, these reform societies that were trying to create this benevolent empire, had a bunch of different related things that they were trying to do. One of those was the temperance movement, which was this idea of stopping people from drinking alcohol through firm encouragement, we might say. Another was the abolitionist movement to try to end slavery. Other movements tried to end prostitution or find home for orphans, or try to get people to keep the Sabbath day holy, or to reform the prisons to become more humane. All of these various movements were things that men and women got involved in to try to make America a better place. The most prominent of these movements during this time period was the American Temperance Society, whose goal was to remove alcohol consumption from society because they saw the drinking of alcohol as an evil, and they worked relentlessly toward this. They were not the only one of these societies, but they were the largest and most prominent, and they ended up arguably having the most success, at least temporarily, although that's a story for later in American history. Another thing that happened during this time period was the removal of Native Americans from their tribal lands. This had been ongoing since white settlers had first come to the New World and had forced the natives to retreat from their traditional lands. Part of this was because, as we mentioned before, white diseases, I should say European diseases, swept ahead of the white settlers and weakened the native tribes. But the white settlers also brought superior technology with them, such as guns. This enabled the whites to dominate the natives and eventually drive them away. But in some cases, the tribes took a different tactic. Rather than fighting with the encroaching whites, they decided to adopt practices similar to them. In particular, 5 tribes in the southern United States became known as the 5 civilized tribes. They moved into towns. They wore clothes similar to the whites. They developed written languages that they hadn't had before. They created schools, published newspapers. They tried to become, in many ways, like their white neighbors, thinking that then that would cause the white neighbors to not want to drive them away. But it was a false hope, and eventually they were all removed. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, and Andrew Jackson oversaw the forced removal of the remaining members of the 5 civilized tribes to make way for white settlers to take their land. Where were they removed to? To what would eventually become the state of Oklahoma, but during this time period was set aside as an Indian reserve. This Indian removal took place despite the fact that these tribes had legal right to stay on their native lands. This legal right was found in treaties that they had signed with the United States government to prevent them from going to war with each other. The treaties would set aside certain land, what we call reservations, for these tribes to stay on. This was eventually challenged in the United States Supreme Court, whether these treaties were valid, whether the land really did belong to these tribes. The case happened because an American Christian missionary went onto the lands of the Cherokee Nation in Georgia. Now, this was against the law of the state of Georgia. A white missionary like this was not supposed to be going on the Cherokee lands, but the Cherokee tribe tolerated the missionary being there. They were okay him coming and preaching to them. But nonetheless, he got arrested by the state of Georgia for violating their law. And the claim was made in court that it was up to the Cherokee tribe to decide whether he could be on their land, because that was their land by treaty. It was not up to the state of Georgia. The case went with the United States Supreme Court, and the Christian missionary won. This established the idea that the treaty with the tribe could not be overridden by the desires of the state. The Cherokees had a legitimate right to that land by treaty to govern it and keep it as they saw fit. Nonetheless, the government came in and by force removed them. The forced march of these tribes across to Oklahoma became known in history as the Trail of Tears, because so many of them suffered along the way. Well, this Indian removal was seen by many of the social reformers at the time as immoral and inappropriate, and they organized petition campaigns. This is where they would get multitudes of people to sign on to a letter that they would send to some government body saying, "We see what you're doing and we want you to stop doing it." The idea was to use the power of democracy, the fear that politicians have of not getting reelected, to get them to do what the petitioners saw as the morally right thing. In this case, the petition campaign tried to stop the removal of the Indians, and it was put forth by a woman named Catherine Beecher. She was from a famous family in American history. Her father was a well-known preacher, a very controversial preacher, and her siblings all went on to do important things. She was a social reformer. Her sister would eventually go on to write the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which would be one of the things that arguably led to the American Civil War. With that in mind, let's now move on to the abolition movement, the movement to end slavery in America. Early in our country's history, many people thought the way to deal with the problem of slaves was to simply send them and their descendants back to Africa. This was done on a voluntary basis. Societies like the American Colonization Society raised funds to ship people off who had been slaves who wanted to return to Africa. But not all free blacks in the United States thought this was a good idea. For example, David Walker, who was a free black man living in the North, wrote a series of essays collected as his appeal, in which he argued that free blacks had as much right to America as whites, that they had earned their share in America from the sweat of their brow, and that this country belonged to them too, and to try to ship them back to Africa was a racist thing to do. Well, his argument persuaded some people. For example, William Lloyd Garrison, who was a particularly aggressive anti-slavery campaigner. He had originally thought that the colonization idea was good, that since blacks were not being treated appropriately in the United States at this time period, that it would be best to return them to the continent that their ancestors had come from. But he was convinced by the writings of Walker, and in his newspaper, his anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, he began taking a different position, that of universal emancipation. In other words, it is time to immediately just free all the slaves here in America to take part in America. Now, as William Lloyd Garrison campaigned for this, he felt that this wouldn't entirely solve the problem, because America was a country that was poisoned by its embrace of slavery. He felt that the Constitution of the United States itself was illegitimate because it had recognized the practice of slavery as legitimate. The first step was to free the slaves, but an ultimate goal was to redo America. William Lloyd Garrison, along with several other people, formed the American Anti-Slavery Society. This was a biracial society. In other words, both blacks and whites could join it. As a matter of fact, even though William Lloyd Garrison was the president of the society, the vice president was a black man named James Forten. James Forten was in fact the financier behind the society, its primary financial backer. He was a free man who had a thriving business in Philadelphia, making sales for ships. He was wealthy, and he supported this society and its goals. And he believed in the ideal of David Walker that we talked about before, that blacks, when they were freed, should take their place as equal Americans. Well, despite these anti-slavery movements, not everybody was ready to end the practice, particularly in the South, where the economy was dependent upon the use of slaves. But what made it even harder was a general fear in the South of what the slaves would do if they were ever freed. In 1831 in Virginia, a large group of slaves organized a rebellion led by a man named Nat Turner. And they marched from farm to farm, freeing other slaves and slaughtering the whites that they found. They indiscriminately killed men, women, and children. If you were white and they came across you, they would kill you. Their intent was to eventually get slaves throughout the United States to rebel, to overthrow the government and obtain their freedom that way. Well, before they got very far, a militia was called in, they were defeated, Nat Turner was eventually hunted down and executed. And that was the end of that rebellion, but it wasn't the end of the fear that it created. It made most whites in the South afraid that if the slaves ever were freed, that they would rise up and attack their former masters. Well, this debate over slavery and its future in America became so heated that the House of Representatives instituted what became known as the gag rule, which meant in the House of Representatives in the United States Congress, the issue of abolishing slavery could not be brought up. It could not be discussed in that part of Congress. This shows just how deathly afraid people during this time period were of this issue. As mentioned in the previous chapter, it was during this time period that a newspaper publisher named Elijah Lovejoy was killed by a mob. As I described in the previous chapter, he had been publishing an anti-slavery newspaper in Missouri. But as Missouri became a slave state, that became untenable for him. So he moved across the river to Illinois, a free state, to continue publishing his newspaper. But the people in Illinois didn't want him there any more than the people in the South. While they may not have wanted slavery in their state, they were not willing to abolish slavery. They too were afraid of the consequences of it. So they attacked his newspaper office, and eventually he was killed in the assault and became a martyr for the cause of ending slavery. Now, some people, like William Lloyd Garrison, believed that the United States of America was hopelessly poisoned by slavery. But not all abolitionists believed this. Some, like James G. Birney, believed that they could work through the political process, that the Constitution of the United States and the government formed under it was a way to end slavery, not a way to perpetuate it, that all the tools were there to make America a truly free country from top to bottom. They just had to work through the political process to do it. And so, with that in mind, they formed the Liberty Party, an explicitly anti-slavery party, but one that wasn't trying to overthrow America, but work through normal politics in order to change America. While some people were trying to work through politics to change America, some people were working behind the scenes simply to free the slaves. Many Northerners aided runaway slaves to get through the United States and eventually to Canada, where they could be completely free. This led to the creation of what became known as the Underground Railroad, a system of transportation and safe houses and anti-slavery workers that would secretly transport runaway slaves from the South to the North and eventually to Canada, where they could be free. Now, the reason they had to make it to Canada was because although northern states did not allow slavery, if you were caught as a slave in a northern state, you could be shipped back to the South. We'll talk more about that later. But in Canada, slavery was completely banned. So the purpose of the Underground Railroad was oftentimes to get slaves to Canada, or once they had got to the North, to somehow buy their freedom in the South. As I said a moment ago, that the reason they oftentimes had to be transported to Canada was because there was a process for capturing slaves in the North and returning them to the South. There is a passage in the Constitution that requires northern states to cooperate with southern states. And in 1850, a law was passed to strengthen this process, called the Fugitive Slave Act. It increased penalties for any government official in a northern state that refused to help slave catchers from the South capture runaway slaves. It also increased penalties for civilians in the North who assisted runaway slaves. It was an attempt to make the Underground Railroad illegal. Nonetheless, public opinion in the North continued to move away from slavery. This was helped by in 1845 the publication of a book written by a former slave named Frederick Douglass. It was a narrative of his life, an autobiography. Frederick Douglass had been born into slavery, had eventually escaped to freedom. Along the way, he had essentially taught himself to learn how to read and write, something he'd been forbidden to do as a slave. It turned out that he was quite talented at reading and writing and public speaking. When his book was published, it became a sensation, and he went around giving public lectures to advocate for the end of slavery and became a powerful voice in the abolitionist movement. But some people in that movement didn't just want to talk about ending slavery. They wanted to take aggressive action, not unlike the slave Nat Turner, who organized the bloody Matt Turner's Rebellion. One of those people who wanted to be more aggressive was a man named John Brown. He was a white man who believed that America's sin of slavery could only be purged by blood, that an uprising needed to take place in which abolitionists supporting whites and free blacks would overthrow the government of the country. To try to get that going, he led a group of people to attack an armory containing weapons of the United States government in a place called Harper's Ferry in what is now today West Virginia. Before they could take over the armory and get the arms and start passing them out to slaves to start attacking their masters, they were confronted by U.S. Army troops. And the leader of those troops was a man named Robert E. Lee, who would show up later in history as the leader of the Confederate armies during the Civil War. John Brown's followers, including a couple of his sons, were killed in the ensuing battle, and John Brown was captured. He'd eventually be tried and hanged. While some people viewed him as an awful criminal who was trying to inspire a race war, others viewed him as a martyr to the cause of ending slavery. This is a mural that is painted on the wall in the Kansas State House. This shows how some people out on the frontier in anti-slavery areas viewed John Brown as a hero as he tried to spawn a civil war in America over slavery. Slavery wasn't the only issue that was on the mind of social reformers during this time period. So was the place of women in American society. Now remember, we've talked before about how there was this ideal in America during this time period of separate spheres, where the man would go out into the dirty, vile world and do what it took to earn money to take care of his family, while the mother would stay home and create a heaven on earth where their children could be raised peacefully and in righteousness, away from the evils of the world. Now, this wasn't always the way things actually were, particularly as many mothers had to go to work in factories, even children did. But this was the ideal, that women had one place in society and men had a different place. But women oftentimes wanted to do more for the world around them, not just for their children. They saw themselves as moral guardians of society, and they would sometimes create charitable organizations toward that end. An example here is this American Female Guardian Society and Home for the Friendless, where they would take women in who had no other place to go and provide for them. Well, this shows how women wanted to reach outside the home and do more good in society than just what they were doing for their own children. One of the areas that many women gravitated to was the abolitionist movement, and they became very active in it, trying to end slavery. Here are pictured 4 prominent women in the anti-slavery movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony would eventually become famous for their work for the women's rights movement, but they began as abolitionists. Sojourner Truth was a black woman who also became a prominent abolitionist. But at this point in the story, we want to focus on Lucretia Mott. She was a prominent abolitionist who worked tirelessly for the cause and went around and gave speeches and things like that. But she ended up in a way feeling betrayed by it, which I will talk about in a moment. Some of the most prominent women who were advocates for the end of slavery were the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah. They went around giving anti-slavery speeches that were a sensation. They traveled the country giving lectures against this practice that they viewed as so evil. Eventually, there was a World Anti-Slavery Convention held in London in 1840, as activists from all over the planet, from places where slavery had been practiced or was practiced, came together to discuss how it could be ended across the world. Lucretia Mott, as a prominent abolitionist in the United States, went to attend this meeting, but she was barred from participating in it because she was a woman. It was supposed to be a men's-only meeting. Well, this then led her and Elizabeth Cady Stanton to decide that maybe before they could be campaigning for the end of slavery, they first had to get women in a position that they could actually have enough power to help end slavery. And they transitioned from being abolitionist crusaders to being women's rights crusaders. They organized a conference in Seneca Falls, New York, where women could come and talk about what they could do to get rights more nearly like those of men. A document was produced by that conference called their Declaration of Sentiments, modeled after the Declaration of Independence and written primarily by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In it, among other things, they demanded that women have property rights, that even married women should be able to buy things on their own and own them, that they should have access to professions, that they should be able to go to school and train for them and become doctors, lawyers, or whatever it may be. And probably most importantly, that they should be given the right to vote the same as men. They didn't succeed in getting all these things immediately, but this was something of a controversial sensation that this conference was held, and it made so many far-reaching demands. And that concludes the material for Chapter 10.